Picture driving through California and finding entire towns where no one lives anymore. Houses standing empty, businesses boarded up, streets eerily silent. Half of California's land sits practically deserted in 2025. And what's happening in these 10 abandoned communities will shock you. But the reasons behind this mass exodus reveal something darker about America's most populous state that most people never see. The numbers are staggering when you look at California's actual population distribution. 80% of the state's 39 million residents cram into just 20% of the land, mostly hugging the coast in major metropolitan areas. That leaves vast stretches of the Golden State practically empty, with population densities lower than some parts of rural Wyoming. Drive through the Central Valley or venture into Northern California's interior, and you'll find dozens of ghost towns scattered across the landscape like forgotten relics. These aren't ancient mining camps from the 1800s. Many were thriving communities just decades ago. Since 2020, rural areas across California have seen their populations plummet by 15%, the steepest decline in the state's modern history. The economic toll is brutal. California loses $2.3 billion in tax revenue annually from these emptying regions, money that once funded schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. When a town loses half its residents, it doesn't just lose half its tax base. It loses the critical mass needed to support basic services. Grocery stores close, gas stations shut down, and eventually even the post office disappears. What makes this exodus particularly alarming is its acceleration. While some rural decline is normal as economies shift, California's rural areas are hemorrhaging people at rates that suggest something more serious is happening. The question isn't just about numbers on a census report, it's about entire communities vanishing from the map. But why are people fleeing? The reasons go deeper than most realize. Take Body, California's most famous ghost town, where you can walk through streets that once bustled with 10,000 residents, but now house absolutely no one. In 1880, this high desert mining camp was one of the most notorious boom towns in the American West, complete with saloons, brothels, and enough violence to earn it the nickname Shooter's Town. The numbers tell the story of both incredible wealth and inevitable collapse. Miners pulled $30 million worth of gold from the surrounding hills. That's over $800 million in today's money. But when the ore ran out in the early 1900s, so did the people. The last mine closed in 1942, and by 1962, Bodie was officially a ghost town. What killed Bodie wasn't just the end of gold. It was the brutal reality of living at 7,500 feet elevation in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Winters here are legendary, with temperatures plunging to negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit and snowdrifts that could bury entire buildings. When the economic incentive disappeared, no one wanted to endure another winter in this frozen wasteland. Today, Bodie attracts 200,000 tourists annually who pay to walk through its perfectly preserved streets and peer into abandoned buildings. The irony is striking. More people visit Bodie dead than live there at its peak. The California State Park System spends over $1 million yearly maintaining this monument to boom and bust economics. While Bodie died from resource depletion, other towns face modern threats. Imagine a town literally drowning in slow motion, and you'll understand what happened to Drawbridge, a unique community built on stilts in the San Francisco Bay wetlands. In the 1920s, 90 residents called this floating hamlet home, living in houses perched above the marshy waters where they hunted ducks and geese in what seemed like an aquatic paradise. Drawbridge wasn't your typical California town. It had no roads, no cars, and no traditional main street. Residents traveled by boat or walked along railroad tracks to reach their elevated homes. The Southern Pacific Railroad built the original settlement as a drawbridge tender station in 1876, but it evolved into a weekend retreat for San Francisco hunters seeking escape from city life. The town's death sentence came from human interference with nature itself. By the 1950s, massive salt production operations and urban development began altering the bay's delicate ecosystem. Saltwater intrusion increased dramatically as freshwater flows were diverted for agriculture and municipal use. The once pristine hunting grounds turned brackish and toxic, driving away the wildlife that sustained the community's economy. By the 1980s, rising salt levels made the area completely uninhabitable. The last residents abandoned their stilted homes as corrosive salt water ate away at foundations and contaminated drinking water supplies. Today, you can only reach drawbridges' rotting remains by boat or by hiking, dangerous, unmarked trails through unstable marshland. Climate scientists warn that rising sea levels threaten to submerge the last remnants of drawbridge entirely within the next 2 decades. Environmental destruction isn't the only modern killer of California towns. Calico represents the classic boom-bust cycle that has littered California with ghost towns for over a century. This Mojave Desert silver mining camp exploded from nothing to 1,200 residents in just 5 years during the 1890s, then vanished almost as quickly when the ore ran out. The numbers reveal the brutal mathematics of single-industry towns. Between 1881 and 1896, miners extracted $20 million worth of silver from Calico's hills, equivalent to over $600 million today. The town boasted 22 saloons, a school, a post office, and even a newspaper called the Calico Print. But when silver prices crashed and the mines played out by 1907, the entire population simply walked away. What makes Calico's story particularly revealing is how quickly prosperity can evaporate. In 1896, the town was at its peak with bustling streets and thriving businesses. 11 years later, tumbleweeds blew through empty buildings. The collapse was so complete that by 1915, you could buy the entire town for $900. Today's Calico tells a different story about California's ghost towns. Walter Knott of Knott's Berry Farm fame restored the town in the 1950s as a tourist attraction, and it now draws 250,000 visitors annually. The irony is striking. Calico makes more money as a fake Wild West theme park than it ever did as a real mining town. The lesson here cuts deep. Any community dependent on a single industry lives on borrowed time. But some towns didn't die from mining collapse. They faced something worse. Sometimes a single decision by distant corporate executives can murder an entire town. And nowhere is this more dramatic than in Shasta, California. Picture a thriving county seat with 3,500 residents, bustling businesses, and bright prospects for the future. Then watch it all disappear because railroad executives drew their line on a different part of the map. Shasta was the Queen City of Northern California's mining region in the 1860s, serving as the county seat and the main supply hub for gold miners heading into the mountains. The town had every reason to expect continued growth when the Central Pacific Railroad began pushing north from Sacramento. Local leaders even invested heavily in preparing for the railroad's arrival, building new hotels and expanding businesses to handle the anticipated boom. But in 1872, railroad engineers chose a route that bypassed Shasta entirely, running their tracks through what would become the city of Redding instead. The impact was catastrophic and immediate. Within 5 years, Shasta's population plummeted by 90% as businesses relocated to be near the railroad depot. The county seat moved to Redding in 1888, delivering the final blow to Shasta's hopes. Today you can visit what's left of this once prosperous town, a crumbling brick courthouse, and a handful of deteriorating buildings scattered among the oak trees. The Courthouse Museum attracts a few thousand visitors yearly, but they come to see ruins, not a living community. Shasta's story reveals how quickly economic lifelines can shift, leaving entire communities stranded. Transportation isn't the only infrastructure that can doom a town. Locke tells the story of how communities can slowly bleed to death over decades, losing their soul one resident at a time. This unique Chinese immigrant town in the Sacramento Delta once housed 600 people in the 1920s, making it the largest rural Chinatown in America. Today, only 8 permanent residents call Locke home. Built by Chinese laborers who were forbidden from owning land elsewhere, Locke thrived during Prohibition as a gambling and entertainment destination. Riverboats brought visitors from San Francisco to sample the town's speakeasies, opium dens, and gambling halls. The main street buzzed with 13 restaurants, 6 grocery stores, and multiple hotels catering to both residents and tourists seeking forbidden pleasures. The collapse came gradually as laws changed and generations passed. When Prohibition ended in 1933, Locke lost its main economic draw. Anti-gambling enforcement in the 1950s shut down the remaining vice operations. Younger Chinese Americans moved to cities for better opportunities, leaving behind an aging population that dwindled year by year. Today's Locke is a living museum fighting for survival. The town needs $1.2 million in critical repairs to save its deteriorating wooden buildings from collapse. But with only 8 residents, there's no tax base to fund preservation efforts. The California Department of Parks and Recreation has designated Locke a National Historic Landmark, but designation doesn't pay for rotting foundations or leaking roofs. Walking through Locke's empty streets feels like witnessing a community's final breath. While some towns fade slowly, others face sudden, catastrophic abandonment. Llano del Rio proves that good intentions aren't enough to build a lasting community. This socialist commune in the Antelope Valley promised to create a perfect society where 1,100 residents would share everything equally and live in harmony with nature. Founded in 1914 by lawyer Job Harriman, Llano was supposed to demonstrate that cooperative living could replace capitalism's cutthroat competition. The utopian vision attracted idealistic families from across America who invested their life savings in the dream. Residents built schools, workshops, and farms designed to make the community completely self-sufficient. They constructed a massive hotel, established their own currency, and even started a newspaper to spread their socialist message. For a brief moment, Llano seemed to prove that alternative economics could work. But reality crushed the dream within 4 years. Water rights disputes with neighboring ranchers created constant legal battles that drained the community's finances. Poor agricultural planning left crops failing in the desert climate, while internal power struggles split the leadership. Financial mismanagement meant that despite members' contributions, totaling over $2 million in today's money, the commune couldn't pay its debts. By 1918, Llano del Rio was bankrupt and abandoned. Today, you can still find crumbling foundations and rusted machinery scattered across the desert floor, monuments to utopian ambitions that couldn't survive California's harsh economic and environmental realities. The ruins attract occasional visitors who come to see what remains of America's most ambitious socialist experiment. Idealism wasn't the only thing that couldn't survive California's harsh realities. Rough and Ready takes political rebellion to its logical extreme, seceding from the United States entirely. In 1850, this gold rush mining camp declared independence over a dispute about federal mining taxes, making it the only California town to officially leave the Union before the Civil War even started. The rebellion began when 300 angry miners decided they'd rather form their own country than pay what they considered unfair federal levies on their gold claims. Led by Colonel E.F. Brundage, they drafted a constitution, elected a president, and for 3 months operated as the Great Republic of Rough and Ready. The tiny nation even issued its own currency and postage stamps. The political theater might seem amusing today, but it devastated the community's long-term prospects. The secession scared away legitimate businesses and potential residents who wanted stability, not revolutionary politics. When the miners realized they couldn't celebrate July 4th as foreigners, they sheepishly voted to rejoin the United States just in time for the holiday. But the damage was done. The town's reputation for political extremism and instability followed it for decades. Families with children avoided settling in a place known for radical politics, and businesses preferred more predictable locations for their investments. While nearby Nevada City and Grass Valley thrived as the gold rush evolved, Rough and Ready stagnated. Today, fewer than 900 people live in the broader Rough and Ready area, a fraction of what neighboring communities achieved. The lesson is clear. Political extremism is economic poison for small towns. Political problems pale compared to the environmental disasters that created other ghost towns. Keeler represents environmental catastrophe in slow motion, where an entire lake disappeared and took a thriving town with it. In the 1920s, 5,000 people lived along the shores of Owens Lake, working in mining operations and enjoying life beside California's second-largest lake. Today, only 50 residents remain in what's become a toxic wasteland. The destruction began when Los Angeles decided it needed Owens Valley's water more than the valley's residents did. Starting in 1913, the city's aqueduct system diverted the streams and rivers that fed Owens Lake. By 1926, the 110-square-mile lake had completely dried up, exposing a poisonous lakebed filled with arsenic, cadmium, and other toxic minerals. What followed was an environmental disaster that made the area nearly uninhabitable. Winds whipping across the exposed lakebed created dust storms so toxic they violated federal air quality standards more than any other location in America. Residents developed respiratory problems, children couldn't play outside on windy days, and property values collapsed as families fled the choking dust clouds. The irony is staggering. Despite spending over $2 billion on lake restoration projects since the 1990s, Keeler remains largely abandoned. The Department of Water and Power has managed to control some dust emissions by flooding small sections of the lakebed, but the town never recovered its population or economic base. Keeler's story reveals how water rights disputes can literally erase communities from the map. Water wasn't the only natural resource that abandoned California towns. These ghost towns aren't just relics of California's past, they're previews of its future challenges. Climate scientists have identified 23 small California communities that face similar abandonment risks within the next 2 decades due to rising sea levels, extreme heat, and water scarcity. The patterns that destroyed Body, Drawbridge, and Keeler are repeating themselves across the state. The housing crisis is creating a dangerous irony. As coastal cities become unaffordable, desperate families are moving to some of these risky areas, drawn by cheap land and low rents. They're essentially betting their futures on places that environmental and economic forces are trying to abandon. Paradise, California, rebuilt after the devastating Camp Fire, exemplifies this trend. People returning to areas where disaster struck because they have nowhere else to go. The financial burden is staggering. California spends $50 billion annually maintaining infrastructure and services to remote areas with shrinking populations. That's money that could address urban housing shortages or climate adaptation, but instead goes to keeping ghost towns on life support. The lesson from every abandoned town is the same. Economic diversification isn't optional, it's survival. Communities that depend on single industries, whether gold mining or oil extraction, inevitably face collapse when those resources disappear or markets shift. Towns that fail to adapt to transportation changes, environmental threats, or demographic shifts get left behind. These empty towns aren't just historical curiosities. They're warnings about California's future. The state's next ghost towns are being created right now, and the only question is whether we'll learn from the past or repeat its mistakes.